Oftentimes, many musicians, whenever they're playing and looking for chord substitutions, they look at chords they may have memorized or chord groupings or something new to add to what they already know. What I'm going to show you here is called the flat 5 chord substitution. Before I get into that, go check out my free guide over at gospelprogressionsuniversity.com. It's called What Do Pro Musicians Know That You Don't? Now, with the flat 5 chord substitution, we first have to look at triads. Okay, so let's take a look at the C major triad. We have C, E, G. If we added to that triad, we went up from G to a major third B, we would have a C major 7 triad. Now, if we altered 2 of those notes or changed 2 of those notes, it would give us a different tone. So if we took the B and we dropped it back a half step, we have B flat. This chord here, C, E, G, and B flat is our C7. So now if we took that a step further, we have our G. We took the G and brought it back a half step. We would have a 7 with a 1 being C, 3 being E being 3, and G being 5. We flat the 5. We have a C7, flat 5. Now, with that chord, the same exact chord, if we took it and we inverted it, and we said, okay, now we'll start from the G flat, F sharp. G flat, F sharp, and we'll act like that's 1. The G flat, F sharp, our B flat is our 3 for G flat. Our C now becomes the flat 5 because G flat, F sharp, B flat, D flat being raised or lowered, to a half step down to C is a flat 5. And our 7, which would be F related to G flat, would be the 7. We lowered that. We have a G7 flat 5. C7 flat 5, G flat, F sharp, 7 flat 5. So these two are related. So when we look at a dominant chord or a 7 chord with a flat 5, we have what's called a flat 5 substitution because we can interchange the G flat 7 or the C7 flat 5. Either way, it works because it's the same chord, the same sound sonically. So now that we know what a flat 5 chord is, now let's look further in how we can actually use it as a substitution. Typically, a substitution would take place over a 5 chord, or we would replace the 5 chord, which would be a dominant chord, and use that and substitute that. But there's a way that we can actually do it. So now, let's look at a 2-5-1 chord progression. 2-5-1 in the key of C, of course, would be D, G, and C. So now that we know what our flat 5 chord substitution is, how can we relate that to an actual practice, an actual substitution? Looking at a 2-5-1 chord progression, this is how I incorporate everything. And everything is related, like I mentioned. So the first chord for a 2-5-1 chord progression would be a minor 7 flat 5 because I'm taking C minor, C natural minor, or E flat, major. So 2 and the dominant chord 5, and then we resolve to 1. So I'll take that flat 5 and I would say, well, I know that the 5 is going to be G7 and the flat 5 of G would be D flat. So I know that D flat 7 and G7, we'll play it like this. G7 share the same tones. Share the same 2 most important tones, which is the third and third or 7 respectively. So third for G, 3rd for D flat. F is the 3rd for D flat, or the 7 for G, and B is the 3rd for G, and the 7 or the flat 7 for D flat. So I can interchange, and I say, all right, 2, and I can go to 5, D7, and then resolve back to 1. But recognize that everything is really related. Everything in the keyboard is not like, one key is for that, this other key is for this. When we think of scales or how things are related, we see that we have friends of friends of friends, or everything is related, everybody's related. And what I mean is this. We have a 2 chord and we have a 5 chord, right? So if G is related to D flat, what is D flat related to? Where does D flat come from, or D flat 7 come from? D flat C sharp 7 would come from F sharp G flat major. All right, so if we play this, well, we know that the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and this would be the G flat major scale. This D flat here is related somehow to G flat. In fact, the D flat 7 is related to G flat. So if D flat 7 is related to D flat and G7 is related to D flat, that means that G7 would have to somehow be related to D flat, just by means of them sharing the same tones, or harmonizing, I should say, They have different tones, but they harmonize with tones that work together. So if I wanted to do something like this, if I did, and I said, it would make sense too, wouldn't it? Because they all relate to one another. And that's how I look at chord substitutions. I can take it a step further and say, okay, well, since I know it harmonizes with G flat major, what about, G flat melodic minor, which would be G flat, A flat, A, B, D flat, E flat, F, G flat. It's just G flat, but with one thing that changes, which would be the third, and we flatten that and make that into an A. So that's your melodic minor. So I can take this, the same motif that I did before, and go, and let's do right, what'd I do? Yeah, and do something like that, okay? Or I can take that same thing and take the harmony even further, being that I know, remember, we started on the flat 5 chord substitution. The flat 5 itself is related to something else, which in turn is related to something else. Like I said, everything else is related. So if I said, okay, now, instead of thinking chords and memorizing a bunch of chords, think scales. I want you to get away from thinking about chords or what key that you're in and concentrate on scales. Because when you think about that, it matters less and less about the chord progression. It more matters with what harmonizes with what you're actually playing. Meaning that now that we have our first chord, right, we can, and I can do, and then go right back to what I started on. Why that works is because I'm playing, again, this is from, this is from our G flat melodic minor. So instead of playing the root, which would be in the root of G flat melodic minor would be, the first tone would be G flat. We can take that and play the 6th tone, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And all of this coming from the flat 5 chord substitution. Again, to reiterate, we get that because G, in this case, is related to G7, is related to D flat. D flat is related to G flat by way of being its 5th scale tone. The 5th scale tone in a major key is going to be dominant every time. Whether it's the melodic minor, it happens to be. All right, its 5th scale tone happens to be 7. So if it relates to these, they all harmonize with one another. It doesn't matter where you are on the keyboard. You can take that now and say, all right, well, I want to relate it to something else. So again, we learn about the substitution, the flat 5 substitution. You can say, well, I take my dominant chord anytime I want to have a 2-5-1 chord progression. The 5 is going to be dominant. Or I can make the 1 dominant, or I can make it 2 dominant. It doesn't matter. Anytime I make a dominant, I can take its flatted 5 and substitute it for that given chord. Then on top of that, I wanted to make the harmony more interesting. I could take it a step further. I can substitute the substitution. So the flat 5 substitution also has its own family that it comes from. And this is how we would substitute chords. That's the beginning, and that's the basis of chord substitution. I hope this has helped you, and if it has, please go check out gospelprogressionsuniversity.com/Gospel Keys Pro and download my free guide. It's called What Do Pro Musicians Know That You Don't? God bless you, and I'll see you in the next video.